Good day. Over the last few weeks, a series of articles have appeared in the Western media, specifically in the Financial Times and in Forbes magazine, about the possibility of Japan joining with the United States in a joint military defense of Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attempt to recapture the island of Taiwan by force, ending the drive for Taiwan's independence from China, which has now been ongoing. This series of articles was kicked off by an article which appeared on 30th June 2021 in the Financial Times, and sections of it read as follows. The US and Japan have been conducting war games and joint military exercises in the event of a conflict with China over Taiwan, amid escalating concerns over the Chinese military's assertive activity. US and Japanese military officials began serious planning for a possible conflict in the final year of the Trump administration, according to 6 people who requested anonymity. The activity includes top-secret tabletop war games and joint exercises in the South China and East China Seas. The US and Japan have become alarmed as China has flown more fighter jets and bombers into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, including a record of 28 fighters on 15th June. The Chinese Navy, Air Force and Coast Guard have also become increasingly active around the Senkaku Islands, which are administered by Japan but claimed by China and Taiwan. The US has long wanted Japan, a mutual defense treaty ally, to conduct more joint military training, but Japan was constrained by its post-war pacifist constitution. That obstacle was eased but not eliminated when the Abe government in 2015 reinterpreted the constitution to allow Japan to defend allies that came under attack. 2 of the people said the US military and Japanese self-defense forces had conducted joint exercises in the South China Sea that had been couched as disaster relief training. The countries have also held more military exercises around the Senkaku, which could also help prepare for any conflict with China over Taiwan, which is just 350 kilometers west of the islands. Some of the activities we're training on are highly fungible, a US commentator is reported by the Financial Times as having said. And he added that exercises such as amphibious landing in a disaster relief scenario would be directly applicable to any conflict around the Senkaku or the Taiwan Straits. And in the event of a war over Taiwan, the US would rely on air bases in Japan, but that raises the odds that Tokyo would be dragged into the conflict, particularly if China tried to destroy the bases. So we have a detailed discussion there in the Financial Times about Japan becoming dragged into a war with China over Taiwan and over the Senkaku Islands, which, by the way, were initially and indisputably Chinese, were then captured by the Empire of Japan during its various wars against China at the first half of the 20th century, were then administered by the United States after the end of the Second World War, and then when the United States withdrew from the Senkaku Islands some years ago, to the astonishment and anger of the Chinese, it transferred the administration of the islands back to the Japanese, who supposedly held them on trust, either for China or for Taiwan, both of which claimed them. So the Senkaku Islands have also become a major issue between China and Japan, and no doubt the US decision to transfer administration of the Senkaku Islands to Japan was partly calculated in order to make trouble between Japan and China, in which it has succeeded. But the article in the Financial Times, disturbing as it is actually capped by an even more disturbing article which appeared on 2nd July in Forbes. And Forbes goes a great deal further than the Financial Times article says. And I will again read extracts from it. Japanese authorities, increasingly worried about China's determination to invade and forcibly reunify Taiwan, reportedly asked American officials to share US plans for defending Taiwan. The Americans demurred because they wanted to focus on boosting coordination with Tokyo in phases. A former US official told the reporters the goal was for the US and Japan and their armed forces eventually to write a single integrated plan for a Taiwan contingency. It's fairly obvious what that means. The geography of the Western Pacific region essentially dictates the role Japan would play in an Allied defense of Taiwan. The real revelation isn't the prospect of a joint US-Japanese war plan. It's that Japanese leaders apparently have resigned themselves to war in the event China invades Taiwan. Now that is quite a momentous thing. Japan, in effect, has said that it will go to war with China if there is a Chinese attack on Taiwan. At least that is what this article in Forbes says. And it goes on to say the following. It's quite clear that the United States needs Japanese support in order to stand any chance of defeating a Japanese invasion attempt. The bulk of US forces in the Western Pacific staged from Japanese bases, including Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Misawa Air Base on Honshu, and Japanese ports, including Yokosuka and Sasebo. Ideally, during a counter-invasion campaign, the Japanese government not only would allow US forces to launch combat operations from American bases on Japanese soil, Japanese troops also would join the operation. And then we get into a detail about the implications of all of this. If Japanese troops join the American allies in fighting for Taiwan, they would add mass to the intervention force. By itself, the US Pacific Fleet, with its roughly 200 combat ships, is smaller than China's own fleets, with their 360 frontline vessels. Add Japan's fleet to the American column, and the two sides are roughly equal as far as hulls go. And bear in mind, Japan's warships are unusually heavily armed. Tokyo operates 36 modern destroyers and frigates, many of them with Aegis combat systems, plus 22 of the world's biggest diesel-electric attack submarines. What's more, the Japanese Navy is in the process of converting 2 of its helicopter carriers into aircraft carriers, embarking F-35B stealth jump jets. These flat tops would grow by half the number of big deck aviation ships a combined US-Japanese fleet realistically could project into the Western Pacific. It's clear where Japan would focus its operations as part of an allied force defending Taiwan. The Miyako Strait, a narrow passage between Okinawa and Miyakojima, a Japanese island that lies 277 miles from Taiwan. For a long time, China's plan for invading Taiwan was simple: bombard the island, then sell as many transports as possible across the 80-mile wide Taiwan Strait to the beaches of southwestern Taiwan. But a direct attack would be a bloodbath. The Taiwanese armed forces have had decades to fortify the obvious approaches. They would contest every mile with torpedoes, mines, artillery, and missiles. Increasingly, the Chinese Navy and Air Force are exploring indirect approaches to Taiwan that would allow them to bypass the stiffest beach defences. Beijing is acquiring aircraft carriers in part to provide air cover for warships operating east of Taiwan. There are two ways for Chinese forces to break out into the Philippine Sea. One that could fly or sail around southern Taiwan through the Mercouris Strait, southeast of the island. The southern option is risky. Taiwan is building up a force of more than 200 new and upgraded F-16 fighters. One of their missions in wartime would be to patrol the Mercouris Strait. One analyst even urged Taipei to buy aerial tankers to help the F-16s spend more time over the strategic choke point. The other option is to punch through the Miyako Strait. That's exactly what the Chinese carrier Liaoning did back in April, in the early days of closely watched deployment to the Philippine and South China Sea. If Japan joined the war over Taiwan, it would transform the Miyako Strait into one of the most dangerous waterways in the world. Taiwan has been fortifying the islands around the Miyako Strait with new radars and anti-ship missiles, and is buying F-35B jump jets to fly from them. So a clear willingness by Japan to send its troops into battle over Taiwan severely complicate Chinese planning, perhaps to the point of making an invasion unacceptably risky. Well, the Chinese have predictably reacted with fury at these reports, which are now getting some coverage in the Japanese media, and which have in part been confirmed by senior Japanese officials. And on the 6th of July, we had this article in Global Times, the unofficial English language mouthpiece of China's government. Japanese politicians slammed over wrong and dangerous remarks on Taiwan, urged to learn lesson from history. Japanese Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso, who recently said Japan would defend the island of Taiwan together with the US if a war erupts across the Taiwan Straits, was slammed by the Chinese Foreign Ministry as wrong and dangerous, with experts saying that the politicians' political manipulations look pale in the face of national strength. Aso, who is also a cabinet member of Japan's National Security Council, said on Monday that a Chinese mainland invasion of Taiwan would be viewed as an existential crisis situation, which would allow Tokyo to deploy its self-defense forces to exercise collective self-defense. Zhao Liqian, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, said on Tuesday that Aso's remarks are extremely wrong and dangerous and gravely undermine the political foundation of China-Japan relations. Zhao mentioned the history of the Japanese militarists' invasion of China in the West in the 20th century, saying today's China is not what it was then, but the Japanese have not learnt the lesson of history. We will never allow a country to interfere in the Taiwan question by any means. No one should underestimate the Chinese people's firm determination, firm will, and strong ability to safeguard national sovereignty. Now, what is one to make of all of this? Well, I'm going to say straight away that it seems to me that some people in Washington and in Tokyo are in the process of taking leave of their senses. The idea of the United States and Japan aligned together to fight China in the Taiwan Straits and in the seas and waters around Taiwan is strategic madness. The idea also that two converted Japanese helicopter carriers could possibly rival the powerful aircraft carriers that China is building, or could withstand the operations of the Chinese Air Force in territories in seas close to the Chinese mainland, is absolute and utter folly. What alarms me about all of this is, again, the fact that some people seem unable to grasp the realities of the geopolitical situation in and around Taiwan, and also are losing sight of the history of Chinese-Japanese relations. Now, I think I'm going to touch on the second first, because they provide what I feel is the essential context. The first point to say is that there is no history of China ever attacking or invading Japan. The nearest we ever got to anything like that was in the 13th century, when the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan, who was at that time also the ruler of China, sent a fleet with the objective of conquering Japan, but which was dispersed by a huge storm, which was then invoked by the Japanese during the Second World War in order to conjure up the legend of the kamikaze. Kublai Khan, I would stress again, was a Mongol. He was not Chinese, and there is no evidence or record of any Chinese official or emperor ever seriously considering the possibility of an invasion of Japan. By contrast, there is a very difficult and complicated modern history of Japanese aggression against China. That began in a serious way in the 1890s, with the first in a series of Sino-Japanese wars, and it culminated in an outright war between China and Japan, in which Japan invaded China, causing enormous devastation in China, and leading in the 1930s to a conflict which began in earnest in 1937 and which eventually became absorbed in the Greater Second World War. This war between Japan and China in the 1930s and 1940s is almost unknown in the West, but it's important to say that in terms of casualties, the Chinese nation may have lost something like 15 million people, which means that it suffered more casualties than any other country in the Second World War, apart from the Soviet Union, which suffered losses of 27 million people. So this war remains a very vivid memory amongst the Chinese. And of course, during that war, the Japanese seized and controlled large areas of Chinese territory, including cities like Shanghai and Beijing and Nanjing. And also, of course, they were also at that time in control of Taiwan. So this is a very vivid and very powerful history for the Chinese, and the Chinese Communist Party, part of its appeal, part of the reasons of its support, the widespread support it commands in China, is because it united China after all these wars. It played an important and significant role, though not an exclusive role, in leading the Chinese resistance against Japan. I would stress that there were other parties in China at that time who also resisted the Japanese, as did China's official government at that time, led by the anti-communist Chiang Kai-shek. But never mind, the Chinese Communist Party, as I said, played an important role in organizing the resistance to the Japanese, and in fact the whole history of the Chinese Communist Party and its legitimacy is bound up with its mission to reunite China, establish China as strong, and of course repel aggression from Western powers, but also and most specifically, if it's ever threatened, from Japan. And what do we see? Here we see Japan saying that it will go to war with China in order to keep separated from China a part of what the Chinese regard as part of their national territory. That is to say, the island of Taiwan. The way this will look amongst many Chinese is that the Japanese, having committed aggression against them in the early 20th century, are preparing to commit aggression all over again by once more seeking to keep separate from China part of its national territory, just as Japan did the same in the early 20th century when it also broke pieces off China and at one time, by the way, supported in the northern regions of China the breakaway state of Manchukuo. So this is precisely the sort of talk that is most likely to inflame sentiment in China and to unite Chinese people even more strongly behind the Chinese Communist Party and to strengthen Chinese determination to win back Taiwan and to repel what they will see as the aggression, not just of the United States, but most particularly of Japan against them also. And it won't just be the Chinese who will feel this way. About many years ago now, but still within my fairly recent memory, I visited South Korea. And what I discovered there is how vivid amongst Koreans the memory of Chinese imperial rule in the early 20th century continues to be. I was struck by the very strong feelings that Koreans still have towards Japan and the sense of bitterness and anger that still continues amongst the Korean people towards Japan. I understand that very little has changed also. And the idea of Japan once again becoming a military power, once again involving itself in wars on the Asian mainland against China. But remember, Korea is also a part of the Asian mainland. I am sure that will alarm and horrify many people in Korea also. There is no doubt at all, to my mind, that whilst Koreans are wary and to some extent suspicious of China, the giant neighbour to their north, it is Japan that raises their primary hackles. And in the event of Japan appearing to take a strong stand against China, that is almost bound to lead to a strong reaction in Korea also. So this policy of involving Japan in a war with China over Taiwan is politically foolish. It's likely to harden feelings in China, and it's likely to alarm feeling in Korea, which, remember, is also a strong or important US ally. And not just in Korea, but many other countries in Asia also have vivid memories of the time they came under Japanese rule. And though I doubt that most of them feel as strongly about this issue as the Chinese and the Koreans do, I can't help but think that if Japan appears to be reasserting itself as a military power, many of these states will become increasingly alarmed, and who knows, they might even start to turn to China in order to protect them from Japan. I'm not saying that will happen, but it's certainly a possibility that should be considered, especially given the fact that the present Japanese government seems to be, frankly, rather sympathetic to some of the goals and objectives pursued by Japan in the Pacific region during the Second World War. What sort of countries am I thinking of? The Philippines, possibly? Indonesia, conceivably? Who knows? Perhaps Malaysia too. But regardless, certainly involving Japan in these sort of adventures seems to me to be reckless and unwise at multiple levels. And then again, there is the military dimension to all of this. I said that Japan's aircraft carriers cannot be by any stretch considered a match either for the aircraft carriers of the US Navy or for the aircraft carriers that the Chinese are now building. But the key point to understand is that however strong the Japanese Navy is, China's Navy is far stronger. And whilst one might conceivably achieve, for the time being, a certain naval balance by joining the Japanese Navy to the US Navy in defending Taiwan, China's productive capabilities are so much greater that it will be only a matter of time before the Chinese again outmatched both the United States and Japan, or at least their navies, taken together. And then again, I have to ask oneself this fundamental question. Does Japan really want to find itself again in another war? Wasn't the previous war, the one that was fought in the 1940s, already a huge disaster for Japan? China, of course, is a nuclear power. Does Japan want to take on a nuclear power like China? Does it want to see its cities potentially targets of Chinese missiles and Chinese aircraft with nuclear warheads? Would it perhaps be should it not perhaps be concerned that in the event of such a war, other nuclear armed countries like conceivably North Korea, which is also fiercely hostile to Japan, might also get drawn in? And what would the Japanese do in response to all of that? Might they, for example, go against the provisions of their own constitution and decide to become a nuclear state themselves? Might they decide that the only way that they could deter a Chinese or North Korean nuclear strike upon Japan would be for Japan also to acquire nuclear weapons? What kind of effect on the whole Pacific region would that have? This is all reckless and foolish and completely misguided policies. And it all originates, in my opinion, from one source, and this is the support that some people in Washington are giving to the independence and secessionist forces within Taiwan. We already see how the United States, as a result, is getting sucked in to a military confrontation with China in and around Taiwan, which every single war game that has been enacted shows the United States would lose. And now it's trying to drag Japan into all of this also, and we see how some foolish Japanese politicians seem to be all too willing to be dragged in and involved in this as well. And again, I come back, this all seems to me utterly reckless and completely misguided, dangerous for China, obviously, dangerous for Taiwan too, but utterly dangerous for Japan, militarizing a country which has prospered and known peace precisely because it put the military adventures of its past behind it. What people need to do is to show some understanding and some sense. First of all, there is no current drive from China to reunify with Taiwan. The Chinese have repeatedly said that though they reserve the right to use force to bring Taiwan back under Chinese control, that is not their priority. They will initially try to draw Taiwan back into under Chinese control in a peaceful way. Now, I am sure that this can be negotiated and brokered in various ways. Now, the Hong Kong affair has ended unhappily, but it seems to me that there is a fundamental difference between Hong Kong, which is part of the Chinese mainland and which is essentially a city-state, and an island of like Taiwan, which is a viable entity by itself and which could function perfectly well in some kind of autonomous relationship within China. Now, I'm not suggesting that Taiwan absorb itself and adopt every aspect of the Chinese political system, but I would have thought that some kind of agreement between China and Taiwan, where Taiwan accepts that it is that it is ultimately part of China, and agrees to coordinate its foreign policies, for example, with China, would be acceptable to Beijing at this time. It would not be a relationship like that between China and Hong Kong, but it would satisfy China's political needs of the moment, and it would secure peace in Taiwan and along the Taiwanese Straits. And it seems to me that the wise policy for the United States is to facilitate talks towards that objective. I mean, giving the Taiwanese the idea that they can withstand China and giving them pledges of support from the United States and trying to drag in Japan in order to make up the numbers is not only reckless and misguided, I'm absolutely sure it will fail, and I frankly very much doubt that if there is a Chinese attack against Taiwan, the United States will in fact want to be involved. In which case, Taiwan and conceivably Japan will find themselves high and dry. But if, on the other hand, all this is serious, if there really are plans to fight China in the Taiwan Straits and in the seas in and around Taiwan, and if Japan is indeed going to be drawn into this conflict, well, as I've said, in that case, we're looking at a naval war and possibly a nuclear war in the Pacific, which it is not in the US's interests to fight. It is not in Japan's interests to fight. It's not in China's interests to fight, and which would and could only be utterly devastating. So, the best thing to do is to pursue the diplomatic solution which I have outlined. It seems to me that this agitation for Taiwanese independence is misconceived and misguided. The reality is that no Chinese government will ever accept it, and with the growth of Chinese power, that position of Taiwan's absolute independence is unsustainable and is becoming it is becoming increasingly dangerous and recklessly so in order to try to sustain it. A diplomatic solution, one which tries to resolve these problems peacefully, as I believe can be done, is obviously the way forward. Otherwise, we're looking at battle lines in the Pacific in a war which is almost certain at some point to be fought, and which is far more dangerous than any war that we have seen at any time since the end of the war in Europe in 1945. Well, I hope that we don't find ourselves in that situation, given the paucity of leadership in the West, and it seems in Japan also. I cannot be sure, but it is still my hope that wiser counsels will in the end prevail. Thank you for joining me in this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel. Please also look us up on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You find links under this video. And please also look us up on our other platforms, BitChute, SuperU, Locals, and the rest. And last but not least, please remember to support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop and buying yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, our hats, and all the rest. Lastly, please check your subscription to this channel and please tick the like button if you've liked this video. And thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to you joining me in future programs, and have a wonderful day until then.